So, as you can see if you're watching this on YouTube, I've decided to drop the slideshow from Superhero Rewind. Believe it or not, I've contended with copyright flags and even strikes because of screen grabs from movies. I've sacrificed not being able to monetize some of these videos for keeping up the production quality, and I've been as satisfied as I can be with their at least being out there and available. There's been enough interest in the series that it's been worth it to take a hit on a few because folks continue to enjoy them, but lately a lot more have been flagged and a couple have even been rendered unviewable worldwide. I think I've gotten those fixed, but it seems like a thing that's just going to keep happening. I filed disputes, of course, on fair use grounds, and sometimes I win those, but it's happening so much more often now. I may have a video up for years that I never had a problem with, and it suddenly gets slapped with a copyright flag. In short, there's no way to be sure the videos will remain available without taking out the screen grabs entirely. Several years back, I posted audio versions, and those are still up in the same form, and I linked a version with movie footage on blip.tv, which is now defunct. I've considered going back to something similar, but I've taken a couple of polls recently, and overwhelmingly our audience seems content with the audio-only versions, as the majority of our viewers aren't really viewers, they're listeners, who already treat Superhero Rewind as a podcast, especially considering how lengthy a lot of the analyses have gotten over the last 4 or 5 years. Hey, superhero movies are more complex now, and I've got a lot to say. That cuts my production time in half, and it makes it easier not to concern myself so much with length. Consider Superhero Rewind a written podcast now. So the bad news is, there's nothing to look at on the screen now, and the pictures were really helpful to provide context for my discussion and jog your memory if it's been a while since you've seen a movie. And you know, it justified putting it on a video platform. The good news is, I can make this series a priority again, as I won't be concerned with not being able to monetize and with the videos not being available. I'm also looking into podcast possibilities, which is something people have been asking for a long time, so stay tuned for an announcement soon about other platforms you might be able to listen to the show on. I will continue to make these reviews as well thought out and interesting and fun as I can. The content will hopefully be of the same quality I've always tried to make it. I hope you'll continue to check out the reviews and that this is a compromise we can all live with, and if there's still a lot of interest, I'll make Rewind my main priority again. So without further ado, here comes my review at long last for Iron Man 3. Thanks for listening, folks. I keep coming back because you guys do, and it means so much to me. You guys rock. I trust all you guys, so I'm going to do something no one has ever done in the history of YouTube or podcasting. I'm going to give out my personal password. Are you ready? It's Captain Logan Rocks with an X. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. There are a few movies I have such an evolving opinion and taste for than Iron Man 3. Every single time I see this one, I have a totally different experience with it. As always, this review is based on my last viewing, but more than maybe any other movie I've tackled thus far, I'm not confident that I'll agree with my own feelings as written next time I see it. It's a tough one for me, because while I recognize the intelligent commentary it offers on post-9/11 War on Terror America, it didn't immediately resonate with me on a personal level. But once I picked up more on how that informs Tony Stark's personal dilemma and what the movie is saying about personas and masks and how we invent ourselves, I realized I should be more at home here than I have been. Like Tony and his effort to find his humanity, my relationship with this film is a work in progress. I'm going to do essentially what Tony does in telling this story to Bruce Banner. I'm going to work out my feelings aloud and see if I can suss out how I really feel about it and what I've learned from it. Here's hoping you don't fall asleep in the process. I'm going to do my best to make it interesting. I realize I've reviewed a couple Marvel films past this one already. Part of that is because I've prioritized a lot of reviews based on the timing of their direct sequels, and Marvel hasn't made a fourth Iron Man film. But if I'm being totally honest, more of it is that for the longest time, I felt really indifferent about this one, ambivalent even. I had zero idea what an in-depth analysis for this looked like. It's a polarizing film that some people despise because they feel cheated out of a grandiose villain they think was promised them in advertising. And some people love it because Tony's mental breakdown and his emergence from his cocoon, as he calls it, resonates with them personally, much like Xavier's did with me in Days of Future Past. And because of the poignant political discussion. It seemed like a movie I was expected to feel strongly about, one way or the other, and though I have a much greater appreciation for it now, especially after the Marvel Mania commentary I did in 2017 with Eric, I still can't get excited or riled up about it, nor have I ever thought I had anything particularly insightful to bring to the discourse before now. Hopefully. But I'm never totally confident in what I think about something until I've written about it, so I guess we'll find out what that is, at least at this very moment, as I prattle on incessantly. If this review seems a little more meandery and wayward than the average rewind, consider it my Iron Man 3 therapy, and you're the person on the other side of the couch. But don't feel the need to take notes, or to draw any Freudian conclusions about my feelings toward my mother. Before I get all horizontal and comfortable, I should mention that I'm coming to enjoy this movie more as I see more of director Shane Black's film catalog. I've become an admirer of his sharp wit, his layered and emotionally complex characters, and his tight and meticulously plotted stories in films like Lethal Weapon and The Nice Guys. A lot of what I love about those movies is here, and I commend Marvel on allowing it not to get caught up in the MCU machine to the point that the unique flavor of his storytelling is lost, despite Marvel forcing him to collaborate with screenwriter Drew Pearce. It's an over-the-top and often hilarious action movie tempered by a flawed but sympathetic protagonist who's really a good guy despite all his efforts to retain his reputation as a jerkface. It's also set at Christmas, has a brilliant kid with a bad home life who helps our hero mature, includes a buddy cop duo of a white guy and a black guy where the black guy is more down to earth and helps ground the white guy, and menacing attack helicopters. I wouldn't have thought of it, but Iron Man and Robert Downey Jr. fit perfectly in Black's wheelhouse. The fresh element he brings to it is his sense of story structure. The Iron Man movies have been made more by the seat of the pants before this. A lot of storytelling through improvising rather than having a complete roadmap drawn by an architect with a vision, which is, incidentally, how mixed metaphors happen. The first film benefited greatly from that approach. The second, not so much. Shane Black works with a cohesive script and is able to tell a more complex story with more moving parts, but he still keeps that spontaneity and sense of collaboration with his actors that made that first film great. I love how this movie acknowledges the unusual way these films were made, and the progression of that method reflects Tony's character progression. Tony forgets how to improvise and relies too much on his suits. He has to relearn what made those suits possible in the first place. He learns to marry his recklessness with a sense of responsibility, maturing the same way these movies have matured. And his antagonist, Killian, is a man who also has only a loose framework of a plan and makes up the details as he goes along, and who doesn't have Tony's newfound temperament because he's inspired by the old Tony. Extremis is like a bad Iron Man 3 plot, something closer to 2, an unstable core with a lot of really good ideas. Now, I'm not saying that's what Iron Man 3 would have been if Jon Favreau had directed it. If he'd come up with the Extremis plan and the Mandarin long con, I doubt he would have been foolish enough not to work with a tighter script. I also don't think that Black or Pearce were cognizant of this idea when they wrote the movie, apart from perhaps an awareness that their protagonist and their lead actor both like to make up stuff in the moment. I've explored the idea of masks a lot on this show, as the exploration of personal identity is a major component of most superhero stories. Some heroes, like Daredevil, put on a mask to hide who they really are. Others, like a lot of versions of Batman, put on a mask to express what they see as their true selves. Rorschach in Watchmen calls his mask his face. The one he was born with is the actual mask, the facade he uses to hide in plain sight. In Jim Carrey's The Mask, Stanley Ipkiss is too afraid to come out of his shell, and his mask reveals a version of himself with no inhibitions, because that's just the most extreme part of his psyche screaming to get out. Neither face is his true face, and he doesn't put that on until the end when he finds his confidence, balanced with even temperament. Whatever a superhero's motivation for wearing a mask, they almost all have one thing in common: a secret identity. This exploration of sense of self, who we are versus the persona we choose to show the world, naturally arises from the necessity of a hero to protect himself and his loved ones. But what sets Iron Man apart is that he has no secret identity. He wears a mask, but it's not really a mask, not like Daredevil's. He told the world who he was at the end of his first movie. He's a public hero from then on, and being who he is, he revels in the attention. He likes getting the praise for Iron Man's heroic endeavors. As we see in Iron Man 2, when Whiplash tries to get his revenge by destroying Tony's reputation, there are consequences to coming out of the superhero closet. We deal with what life for a superhero is like without a secret identity, but there didn't immediately seem to be that standard question: who is Tony Stark and who is Iron Man? Iron Man 3 thoughtfully creates an internal conflict for Tony that organically comes from the slow character progression Tony's undergone so far, through his first two films and the Avengers, that makes the notion as interesting as it's ever been. Tony has a crisis of identity after his whole world seemed to transform at the end of Avengers. First he discovers his heart, then he accepts his mortality, and he finally learns real selflessness when he proves to Captain America he's willing to make the sacrifice play. And then he's still alive. So now what? In a less successful Marvel Cinematic Universe that was somehow coming to an end with that movie, that might have been a fine send-off for Tony, if not a little too neat. Tony thinks his adventure is over after he's given all he has. If he thought of himself in literary terms, he might see himself as a protagonist for whom there's nothing left to say anything with. But Black and Pearce demonstrate their total understanding of who Tony is with a story all about how far he's come, but also how far he still has left to go. As I've discussed ad nauseum in these reviews, Steve Rogers is the hero who comes by his altruism naturally. And Tony is a naturally good man who learns slowly, always the hard way, and he always goes through a character arc kicking and screaming. He's one of the very few characters I can think of who, even aging at the normal rate and never regressing or retconning or rebooting, I can't imagine there would ever be a point where he couldn't continue improving and where we'd run out of things to say with him. Of course, I'm saying that after I couldn't imagine what more there would be to do with him after this film, and then Ultron, and then Civil War. After the battle for New York, Tony doesn't know who he is anymore. He had learned how to give up his life for a world that was bigger than he is, but not to live in it. It isn't that he doesn't recognize himself, it's that he doesn't recognize the world around him. He's used to being in control, never thinking there's anything he can't handle. His sense of self-doubt and inadequacy doesn't come from the same place as Professor Xavier's in Days of Future Past. It doesn't come from failure. It comes from success, interestingly. It's his antagonist, Killian, who's all about failure. Interestingly, Xavier loses himself because he loses confidence in his abilities and in the potential of his cause. Tony doesn't lose himself. He realizes he never really knew who he was in the first place. Tony used his abilities and his ego as a defense mechanism. Once he's, as he describes himself here, just a man in a can, he feels completely vulnerable. I like this movie as the natural conclusion of the arc he began in the first film. It's about learning what the phrase "I am Iron Man" really means. This film suggests that Tony does have a secret identity after all, but it's a secret he's keeping from himself. Yes, he's the guy who made and wears the suit, but who is Iron Man? The irony of Tony Stark's arrogance is that he's so consciously narcissistic, he actually doesn't give himself enough credit for how much progress he's made. Impressively, he retains that arrogant attitude while simultaneously being too hard on himself, and he's wonderfully sympathetic because of that. If Aldrich Killian had shown up in the first film, I don't know that Tony would have fared as well against him. Killian is a monster Tony indirectly made, who's the ultimate extreme of Tony's old attitude. Take as much as you can get, use everyone around you, the world is your playground. But this Tony has moved light years beyond that. He lives primarily to keep other people safe, and is terrified he can't do that because of the imminent danger from other planets and dimensions. He used to be all about control, and even in Iron Man 2, he pats himself on the back for single-handedly privatizing world peace. He isn't trying to control anything but his own fate, which will get him in trouble next time we see him. Again, he has more to learn, and it's always the hard way, and the safety of the people he cares about. By the way, it's possible to make another human being your protagonist's driving motivation without making them an unstable powder keg who would explode and take everyone with them without that person. If I were still doing a slideshow on top of the audio, you'd be looking at a picture of Lois Lane from BVS right now. Tony thinks of his achievements in purely superficial terms. He looks at the specific products rather than the raw materials that made them. his own mind, and resourcefulness. He learns what a lot of insecure teenage heroes do. He knows right from wrong, he's capable, he's sometimes going to make mistakes, which are invaluable if he allows himself to learn from them. He thinks the suit is what makes him a hero, but it's the other way around. He is what makes Iron Man the hero. I love the natural progression of this character and the seamless way Marvel makes a lot of these movies good standalones and simultaneously the next chapter in a vast, ever-expanding drama. You must have this movie before Tony tells Peter in Spider-Man Homecoming, if you're nothing without the suit, you shouldn't have it. Iron Man as a franchise is odd, because it's almost a true trilogy. I can easily chart Tony's emotional journey through the 3 films and make them sound practically deliberate in creating a 3-act arc. Movie 1, Tony finds his conscience. Movie 2, he faces his mortality. Movie 3, he discovers why he was able to survive the cave and change his MO as a weapons manufacturer in the first place. It could be said he finds his spirit here. In each film, he copes with one of the 3 core parts of a healthy, happy human being. First the heart, then the body, then the mind. But it doesn't totally work as a trilogy because there's a pivotal leg of Tony's character arc that's not here and informs the conclusion of it. Tony's self-sacrifice, which shatters his whole worldview. That's wonderfully in character and also hilarious in comparison to Captain America. Tony fights his own humanity so hard, he practically falls apart when he survives a selfless act. When I reviewed The Avengers, I called it Iron Man 2.5. If you ever sit down to watch the Iron Man trilogy, you really can't skip it. And that's not a criticism of either franchise. I'm impressed that this movie feels so connected to the first, and is kind of a repeat of the journey Tony goes through there, armed with the emotional maturity he's gained since he declared himself Iron Man, and without it feeling like a Home Alone-esque formulaic sequel. It's not the same story again, but Tony does go through another Campbell-type hero's journey in Microcosm, which is part of his larger, overarching big hero's journey, which continues well past this movie. I said earlier that Tony has a character arc that starts in the first film and ends here, but that's just one part of a larger continuing journey. Like his origin in the cave, Tony goes on a grueling adventure here that A, is about self-discovery, and is a lesson learned in reverse. In the first film, he builds and puts on a big scary metal suit, which ironically represents his compassion. Here, he learns to rely on the skills that helped him create the suit, and his armorless body ironically represents his strength and ability to protect himself and the people he loves. B, both conflicts are spurred by selfish mistakes Tony makes, and he has to clean up his own mess. In the first film, he pays for his present mistakes. Here, the past does come back to haunt him, but it's an immediate mistake that puts him in the middle of nowhere, relying on his own wits and relatively little else again, when he idiotically gives the Mandarin his home address in a desperate attempt to feel like he can handle his problems. And C, both situations see Tony working with an assistant who is instrumental in helping him on his quest for enlightenment. Yinsen reminds him that other people are affected by what he does. Harley reminds him that he's a mechanic. Reminds him of what he did with Yinsen in the first place. He's not just a man in a can, he's the guy who made the can. Of course, the stakes are much different. Tony isn't in immediate danger of dying here, but the world is relying on him to come out of his existential crisis and defeat the Mandarin. And he doesn't realize it yet, but to defeat the extreme personification of his own obsession with controlling everything around him. It's interesting that his first partner is an old man who dies helping Tony find his heart as he's reborn. Harley is a kid who helps him grow up, and whose life Tony improves because the more he matures, the more he helps make people's lives better. Making the Avengers essential to Tony's ongoing story is also good business for both projects. Of course, we've been hinting at a movie to bring all these characters together since the first Iron Man's after-credits scene, so it would have been more than a letdown if that just played like a skippable romp for any of them. But that means that no franchise could stand on its own without it. Not that anyone is only watching the numbered Iron Mans and skipping Avengers, but I imagine if Kevin Feige and the think tank at Marvel had it to do over again, they'd give the Iron Man movies subtitles rather than numbers from the get-go. And it was really smart to make Tony's experience with the Chitauri the match that sparks his character arc here. Not just because it seems exactly how he would react to that in hindsight, but I don't think I ever could have called his PTSD. But also because Iron Man 3 was the very next film released after Avengers, and was a much more high-profile event. And I imagine it was far more successful than it might have been before that movie, or even a couple films later. Tying it directly to the movie that had a lot of people returning to the theater who might not have been there otherwise was a smart way to retain interest and consumer confidence in Marvel as a studio. Not in communicating that every movie would be about the Avengers, but that this was becoming a tight-knit continuity that remembers with each installment where it was, and that there's a direction moving forward. For at least the tentpoles, each film informs the next, and if you stay invested, you will be rewarded. A lot of us take that for granted now. It's expected. But at the time, it was unclear just how rich, detailed, and complex this universe would become. It's hard to put myself back at a time before Winter Soldier and Civil War, and crazy to think that at the time of this recording, this movie is already 5 years old. But also that the landscape for Marvel and superhero movies in general has changed and become so vast in that time. It's odd going back and finally tackling this, only the 7th Marvel movie, after I've already reviewed Avengers and Winter Soldier. The political nature of this movie is also really interesting, considering the escalation of the themes of control, compartmentalization, duty to country, and freedom versus protection from Avengers all the way to Civil War. At the risk of sounding like I'm just looking for more excuses to gush over Winter Soldier, it's astounding how huge Avengers felt to me at the time, and then the dose of reality Winter Soldier felt like, when the curtain was pulled back with the Hydra reveal and I discovered I had no idea what was really happening in the dark of this world. On this viewing of Iron Man 3, I felt so naive back in the theater, marveling at the scope of this espionage thriller and how deep Killian's long con goes. If only I knew about the length of Hydra's tentacles in every nook and cranny of American government and culture. I talked a lot in the Winter Soldier review about how much more satisfying some of these films are to go back to after later films build on them, when you see more of the steps on that staircase. I appreciate this one more after Winter Soldier because that's a movie about a huge conspiracy, a master plan decades in the making, that I couldn't have begun to call. This villain plot looks like it might be a master plan, with a guy Tony spurned who has every reason to get back at him, and a scheme that looks like it revolves around Tony. And then that's cleverly subverted when we discover that Killian is improvising the whole plan as he goes along. He's just doing what a good writer does, and from the writer-director commentary, it sounds like this movie was fashioned this way. He just keeps building on what he has already and makes sure his continuity is solid, so it looks like it's all part of a grand plan. Then, when Winter Soldier comes out, the plot is closer to what I expected from this movie, a secret mastermind orchestrating and manipulating everything. And because that's so much bigger than I could have imagined, and because this movie threw me off with a con man rather than a master manipulator, I never saw that coming. This movie also throws me off the trail because I'm expecting a particular kind of political commentary, and then the whole thing is about how easy it is to manipulate people because of those very expectations. Making the Mandarin an actor working for Killian was a bold but really, really risky move, especially considering how hard the advertising sold him as a super charismatic and threatening terrorist. But I'll get to all of that. What I love about it is that it manages to be a biting commentary on how apathetic and predictable a lot of our society has become by seeing Killian manipulate the country with a terrorist who says everything terrorists stereotypically say about America, without anyone coming out and actually talking about the stuff he's saying. He's sort of like Bane in Dark Knight Rises if I actually knew what he wanted from the fake revolution, and interesting that the production for these movies overlaps. There's an unsettling amount of truth to things the Mandarin says, and corruption Killian is able to use to sweep deaths he's responsible for under the rug and to get military funding for extremists. He's not ideologically motivated. We don't have an actual character preaching anything except the value of anonymity. The film comes down on what's right and wrong in contrasting its hero and villain, not by discussing politics and corruption overtly, but through their struggle. The movie is criticizing the self-serving priorities of many at the top in business and government. Tony used to do everything for personal gain with little thought to how his actions affected others. That's what Killian does. Tony is a hero now, and Killian is the bad guy. Everyone who puts his own needs and desires in front of the greater good enables the Mandarin hoax to work. Killian is helping the vice president to become president by murdering Ellis, which he does in the hopes of regrowing his daughter or granddaughter's amputated leg with extremis. At least his motivations are a little sympathetic. Everyone seems like a real person in this, except for maybe Killian's henchman Savin, who seems to relish in dirty work, is always eating, so he has some personality quirk, and now that we've had a Deadpool movie, it kind of feels like he belongs more in one of those. But sympathetic or not, the idea is that treating other people as a means to an end isn't sustainable for a society. For example, if Ellis hadn't helped the corporate fat cats get off after the Roxxon oil spill, Killian may not have had an easy motive to manufacture for the Mandarin's public execution of the president. Pretending to be noble and patriotic and for the people, but actually just doing whatever you have to get reelected or make more money creates corruption and mistrust, and that breeds fear. Wasn't it Yoda who said that? Greed leads to corruption, corruption leads to mistrust, mistrust leads to fear? Something like that. So then Killian taps into that fear in creating the Mandarin and is able to play the whole system like, to quote the Penguin from Batman Returns, a harp from hell. Tony's narrations are a little heavy-handed about the themes and lessons about Tony's personal story, as if the script is afraid it's lost perspective, and that stuff isn't inherent enough in the action of the film. But I think the movie gives its audience a lot of credit when it comes to the larger social issues at play, and those ideas are nicely interwoven into the human story. So let's go ahead and pro-con the Mandarin reveal, because I'm very much of two minds about it. Certainly, a fake Mandarin is not what I would have wanted going into the film, but taking the story on its own terms, it wins me over because the villain plot is mostly well thought out and really thought-provoking. Pro, it subverts expectations for the typical terrorist plot. This is a scheme I can't say I've ever seen before. Con, the Mandarin is too visually interesting, and he feels like even as a real terrorist, he could go somewhere fresh and new. The lesson videos are too well written and the character is too distinct, so it's a letdown that there isn't a real Mandarin until I realize what all is going on. He doesn't seem as stereotypical as the movie thinks he is. Pro, Mandarin is a mask. He's integral to the mirror of Killian to Tony. Tony revels in attention and doesn't have a mask, except when he's unsure of himself. He hides behind his public face, and he hides behind Iron Man. By the end, he doesn't hide at all. Killian is all about not being noticed so he can manipulate things behind the scenes, so his public face is a fictitious face. Mandarin as a facade is a wonderful contrast to Iron Man as a solid, tangible man. One does not exist, the other is not a persona, but simply a description of the fully realized Tony Stark. Con, it would have been really, really nice to do that with any other villain but the Mandarin. There was a lot of speculation from before the first film about how the Mandarin might be adapted. He's one of, if not the only Iron Man villain a lot of people had ever heard of. He's not another guy in armor, and he has magic rings. People were really anxious to see how he'd be realized. He's referenced from the beginning with the terrorist group the 10 Rings, and that never pays off. Fans had good reason to expect this scary terrorist would be associated with that group, especially since they're referenced multiple times. Pro, it's not like the Mandarin is a total joke. Trevor is just a drug-addicted, washed-out actor, but in creating the facade, Killian is, as he announces at the end, the real Mandarin. Con, I totally get why that plays for people like a cop-out to appease fans who were hoping for a more traditional, maybe even a more fanciful villain. Again, too much anticipation over several years for how he'd be adapted. I'll talk more about the real Mandarin idea a little later. Pro, I never saw it coming. Con, but again, my heart kind of sunk when I did. The advertising didn't do the movie any favors in this regard either. If it hadn't been sold so hard on the Mandarin, I don't know if it would have upset so many fans, but You'll Never See Me Coming became an instant meme and was quoted all the way up until release like Bane all over again. People expected a really scary villain, and maybe some people who were disappointed with Rises thought he might out-Bane Bane. But I don't think the proximity of release so close to that film did it any favors either. There are a couple places where the movie might be cheating in trying to make us think the Mandarin is real. Killian and Maya occasionally refer to the Mandarin as the Master, even if that's just for the benefit of anyone not in the loop. They only say that around people who know who they're talking about, and throwing around the word master these days, unless you're Alfred Pennyworth, isn't the most inconspicuous word choice anyway. So why not just say the Mandarin, except to keep up the ruse for the audience that they're working for him? I'm also not sure who all in Killian's employ is in the loop. Does he tell the stage crew and guards not to make eye contact with the Mandarin unless they want to get shot in the face to help keep Trevor in character, or because he's keeping the circle of people in the know small? I honestly don't know. But it's cheating if that's just for our benefit, and it does watch like everyone who works for Killian knows what's going on after we do. Also, and this has always bugged me, is the Roxxon exec that the Mandarin ostensibly murders on live television the real exec, or is he an actor? We know Trevor doesn't hurt anyone and believes no one is getting hurt. I would have liked to know what really happened to that guy and who he is. While I'm on the subject of stuff in Killian's plan that's confusing, I do really like that he's an improviser. He thinks on his feet and he's resourceful like Tony, but he has forethought too, except when he doesn't. He's been experimenting with Extremis for a while, and he's creating this long con to cover deaths and get military contracts simultaneously. But unless he can stabilize Extremis, it won't make sense to sell it to the government because they won't keep using a drug that blows people up. I guess unless that's how they decide to weaponize it. But considering the vice president's motive for helping Killian, I'm assuming the plan is to use it for limb regrowth and super strength and becoming a fire-breathing dragon. He and Maya keep working at it, hoping to crack the code, but Tony nearly did that back in Switzerland 20 years ago, and Killian goes to Pepper for help at the beginning of the movie. I get that he's too proud to use Tony without kidnapping him, and that's probably a bad idea unless he's presumed dead. But unless he just goes to Pepper to turn the knife later for Tony, why doesn't he go to her earlier since he's so desperate to fix Extremis? Also, Maya's timing in going to Tony for help is a little convenient. She just happens to go there minutes before her boss blows up the place with menacing Shane Black attack helicopters and has no idea he's going to do that. The movie needs her to hook up with Pepper somehow to do genius inventor love interest parallels to surprise us with the reveal that she's still working for Killian and to give us that admittedly great exchange about starting science from a pure and wide-eyed place but becoming compromised. Again, exactly the sad state so many people find themselves in corporate America that Killian is exploiting. The quick exchange where Maya and Killian talk about what she was doing there is a little awkward, like it's struggling to make me believe and understand the timing and everyone's motivations. And in fact, it wasn't until this viewing I even picked up on that dialogue. I used to be confused about whether Killian knew she'd be at the house when he blew it up. It is cleared up, but it's easy to miss. But my biggest issue with the film is easy contrivances to get us to major developments. The movie is so character-driven it's easy to miss them. It isn't that the whole foundation is laid on a bed of faulty premises, but there are three major ones that really damage my suspension of disbelief. 1. Tony gives the Mandarin his home address and then tries to get Pepper to stay. I understand that Tony is broken there and easily provoked. He doesn't like feeling helpless, and he thinks the Mandarin hurt his friend Happy. I can maybe even understand in an adrenaline-filled moment how he might threaten the Mandarin on national television. He wants to feel like he has some control again, and that's really important. That's the crux of his character arc and the overarching message of the film. People who control themselves in this film are rewarded, and those who try to control others are punished. But Tony's newfound anxiety comes from his fear that he can't protect the one thing he can't live without. But he then stays in the house and tells Pepper not to leave. I don't buy that he wouldn't come to his senses enough to at least send her away. Remember, Tony's primary motivation is keeping Pepper safe, and he's having nervous breakdowns because he thinks he can't do that. And if the idea is that he needs to fight the Mandarin with Pepper in the house to prove he can protect her, then he's way farther gone than I think the movie knows he is. It really needs Tony to hit bottom with his addiction to creating Iron Man armors and being a superhero, and I think it takes him out of character to do it. 2. Tony's whole Odyssey-esque descent into hell and return home comes out of the premise that Tony's suit is out of power. But isn't the arc reactor what powers the suit? And it's working just fine, right? Shane Black brings up this criticism in the commentary and seems frustrated that he made that oversight. There's no explanation for it. That just has to happen so Tony can go on his quest to find himself, and to strand him in the town he needs to be in to progress the Extremis plot. It's also really convenient that Jarvis malfunctions in just the right way in executing a flight plan Tony made earlier for Roseville, Tennessee, that forces Tony into the place where he can continue investigating AIM and Extremis. And 3, Tony is finally able to extract the shrapnel in his chest at the end with no explanation beyond he's a tinkerer and he fixes stuff. He cured Pepper of Extremis and just kept going. This isn't a plot hole, really, and it's the most minor problem of the 3, but my issue is, it's there because it's thematically the natural conclusion of Tony's arc. I mean, it's literally an arc reactor. Almost like a character arc reactor that he doesn't need anymore once he's found himself and isn't fighting his humanity now. But I want to see this naturally unfold and be the culmination of everything he's learned, not a tacked-on thing that happens in a montage at the end. The conflict in the first 2/3 of the last movie was that the Palladium was killing Tony and he had to come up with a new arc reactor he could use permanently. This seems way too easy to me. I do like it on paper. Tony has to put the man ahead of the iron before he can become fully whole. The shrapnel constantly attacking his heart, and a product of his own genius fighting it, is the perfect metaphor for Tony's internal conflict. And when he finally grows beyond that internally, the physical manifestation of it falls away. And like almost everything in this movie, it's a consequence, this time a positive one, of his own actions. I totally buy that his arrogance and then his anxiety held him back from finding the answer before. I like the notion that no matter what other huge technological strides he makes, like the neural link that allows him to mentally call his armor, he can't figure out how to not be dependent on the arc reactor because he thinks it's the technology that makes him Iron Man. I just wish, somehow, that was part of the drama. In his commentary, Shane Black says there was much more to that in earlier drafts, but there wasn't enough room to flesh it out in the film, which is unfortunate. This movie is all about what it means to be a whole person. The message is that you can't be happy only serving yourself, and you have to have some self-control before you can have any mastery of the world around you. In their commentary, Black and Pearce talk about a quote from the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. "He who controls others may be powerful, but he who has mastered himself is more powerful still." That idea is illustrated beautifully in the contrast between Tony and Killian's technologies. Killian is another evil Tony Stark or evil Iron Man. We've had 3 of those already, but he's not just another guy wearing armor. Extremis is a biological technology that's supposed to be the next step in evolution. It's both extreme in its attempt to master nature, and it regrows extremities. But it's fundamentally flawed because the guy who's using it doesn't have his heart in the right place. It's supposed to regrow limbs to make people whole again, but it just desperately tries to fix his host until they finally explode. People on Extremis always ultimately find they cannot regulate. They can't be masters of themselves. And Killian suffers the same fate because he's the ultimate personification of anonymity. He's so concerned with controlling others with an unstable product that he literally and figuratively can't control himself. The Iron Man armor is an empty shell without the heart and mind that makes it Iron Man. I love the moments where Tony stares at an empty helmet, afraid he can't live up to Iron Man, not understanding that Iron Man isn't a separate entity he created. That's why he destroys all the armors at the end. Not because he's through being Iron Man, as I thought on first viewing in the theater, but because he is Iron Man already, and he's been using them as a crutch, looking for purpose and meaning in his creation and not understanding the source of his power. Which is another reason the image of taking out the arc reactor at the end is a great one. Killian calls the armor a turtle shell when he battles Tony toward the end, and he's right. That's what Tony has been using it as. He was receding into that shell, like he's taking his home with him, trying to protect himself with it, rather than using it as what it's really for, an extension of himself designed to protect others. But Tony's shell is always more stable than Killian's, even when he's lost emotionally, because he initially built it for the right reasons. The Iron Man armor isn't an unstable bomb ready to explode any moment, but it does get closer to that, like when Tony can't control his neural link with it and risks hurting Pepper after his dream. The more someone relies on technology to gain control of the world around them, the more volatile and dangerous it is. And that's a lesson Tony doesn't totally learn here. He embraces the man part of Iron Man, but in trying to make sure he can move on with his life and focus on his newfound priorities, he'll make an even bigger mistake with Ultron and create the exact opposite. I also like the Mandarin as a hollow shell Killian can't fill out, the way Tony fills out Iron Man. I latched onto that idea after the Mandarin's lesson about fortune cookies, perpetuating the false motivation that he hates America because it's hollow, full of lies, and leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Again, it's a powerful commentary on the state of this country. It's run by too many opportunists just like Killian, and the country almost loses to him for the same reason he finally loses to Tony, because it hasn't mastered itself in its quest to control everything else. A lot of the film's fans find it a compelling criticism of U.S. foreign policy, which is an angle I didn't fully appreciate until now. But the Mandarin isn't just describing America there. He's describing himself. He's hollow, full of lies, and the possibility of his existence that people could be duped into believing in him is unpalatable. The Mandarin does not exist, and in a way, neither does Killian. He disappeared so far behind the persona of the Mandarin that he really has no sense of his own identity. He tried to become so much the opposite of Tony Stark that he became nothing but a con artist. Interestingly, Tony really never lied to anyone except himself. He wasn't a pretender like Justin Hammer or a schemer like Obadiah Stane. Killian realizes the drawbacks to Tony's public face, and following the allure of fame and recognition over real power, and in shooting off in the clear other direction, he becomes nothing. No one. When he says, "I am the Mandarin" toward the end, there's a stark contrast. See what I did there? To Tony's "I am Iron Man." There is a real Mandarin in the movie, but he needs his extremis and his facade and his conspiracy, and it's all unstable and crumbling as he says that. Tony proves he is Iron Man with nothing at all. The Mandarin is precisely that, nothing at all. Finally, besides the masks and identity motif, there are several other superhero movie tropes and motifs Iron Man 3 employs in fresh and subversive ways. Like the first film, it's a superhero movie that doesn't conform to the traditional formula and puts the espionage genre in front of the superhero stuff. But there is a lot more of that superhero stuff. First, the "you kidnapped my girlfriend" plot. On first viewing, I really questioned going back to this old chestnut because it's such a cliche, easy way for a villain to lure a hero, and the first two movies totally avoid it in favor of making Pepper essential to Tony's success. But it's actually crucial to understanding Killian, and Pepper is still crucial to Tony's success. Killian doesn't kidnap Pepper just as bait. He wants to prove to Tony that he's as brilliant as Tony is and worthy of the same successes. His motivation isn't revenge, but he wants to take Pepper as a trophy to show Tony what he created and what he's lost because he wouldn't give Killian the time of day in the first place. None of which he'd do if Pepper just agreed to work with him at the beginning, although there probably would have still been gloating. While we're there, Pepper remains one of the best love interests in superhero movies because she defines Tony. He needs her to help him discover his true self because she can see beyond the arrogant mask. She's something Killian doesn't have in Maya, someone who won't compromise her principles for the bottom line and who remains idealistic in a cutthroat business world. And I like that she's inherently heroic like Tony is. Maya is a foil for Pepper in the same way Killian is a foil for Tony. They both start as good people who are into scientific research for the right reasons, for the sake of exploration and human advancement, but who become, as Maya says, compromised as they decide their ideals are incompatible with the harsh realities of our cynical world. She allows Killian to change and use her and ultimately loses her life when she tries to do the right thing. It's the opposite relationship from Tony and Pepper's. Tony puts Pepper in danger because of his insecurities in trying to protect her. Killian puts Maya in danger and then murders her because he's lost all regard for other people. Maya is wonderfully tragic, and I love what her arc says about our other principal characters. She can't keep to her convictions like Pepper does. She does decide to stop trying to control things like Tony does, but she does it too late. It's her research that leads to a bunch of experiments that end in death and in the fear and discontent sown by the Mandarin Con. She and Killian are the tragic versions of Pepper and Tony, and what makes it sadder is that if Tony had only wound up in the cave earlier, he might not have created this twisted version of that relationship. After all, it's his actions that set things in motion of who both of them end up becoming. Other superhero motifs include, as mentioned, the hero who creates the villain, which is made fresh here because Tony is practically a totally different person as the past of a version of himself he hardly recognizes comes back to haunt him. We have the villain who asks the hero to join him, this time not because he thinks he can appeal to his vanity or sway him with ideology, and he doesn't say, "We're the same, you and I." He says, "You spurned me and I learned from that. Because of your rejection, I manipulated the world into giving me everything. And now you're going to help me because that allowed me to take everything away from you." Well, he doesn't actually say that, but that's what his actions are saying. And he doesn't really ask the hero to join him. Maya does that with Pepper because she's still trying to salvage the situation and turn it into something remotely positive because helping people was what she was always in it for in the first place. Killian hates that idea and only goes to Tony to try and force his cooperation when he has no other choice. And we also have the classic sadistic choice, but not with the cackling laugh and curtains 1 and 2 or a grand showdown over a bridge at night. When Killian tries to put Tony and Rhodey in a position to have to choose between saving Pepper and saving the president. And now, other disparate and random thoughts. I have a wild notion regarding Tony's attempt to feel in control that may be a crazy leap, and I have no idea if it was what was intended by the filmmakers. It's related to, of all things, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Hear me out, folks. Tony's latest armor is the Mark 42. Most sci-fi fans know that number as the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And it's so famous, it's referenced constantly, and any time that number shows up, I always wonder if it's an intentional nod to Douglas Douglas Adams. In Hitchhiker, the answer to that ultimate question is known, but its meaning is a mystery, because no one knows what the question is. Intended or not, this idea is totally present in Tony's arc. He's trying to answer his own ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. He's having anxiety attacks, and he doesn't understand why. All he knows is that thinking about the wormhole freaks him out. He's trying to solve his own neurosis without knowing the cause. The Mark 42 is his attempt at answering the question without knowing the question. When he's in Roseville, Harley finally reveals the question. Who are you? Who is Iron Man? And together, they answer it. He's a mechanic. The answer to the ultimate question is not 42. The I'm Blue song is an appropriate, if not hilarious, choice to open the film with. It suggests that happiness comes not from the accumulation of wealth or stuff, but from something purer. This movie has one of the most fun and engaging closing credits of all time. It's easily my favorite of the Marvel films. It's the main orchestral theme of the film turned into an explosive, upbeat, big band jazz number, set to what looks like the opening titles of a 70s action movie or TV show. If I had included in credits with my top 10 opening titles rewind, this would have been in the top 5. I've had it stuck in my head the entire time I've been working on this review, and I think if this had been an old TV intro, we'd remember it today along with Hawaii Five-0 and the A-Team. It's one of Marvel's best themes, and certainly the best of the Iron Man movies, which haven't had one iconic theme associated with the character. That's appropriate because he's such a fluid and always changing guy. I love that we celebrate Tony finally coming to really find his heroic self by giving him the intro to his own superhero TV show. Like, there was still a question of just how heroic is he really all the way up until now. It's like if you didn't get the majestic Christopher Reeve Superman titles until he'd earned them. And I feel like I'm being rewarded for going on this journey with Tony. I like that the story about the security of our country in danger from a supposed foreign threat who turns out to be in America is a product of immense insecurity. Also, Happy is a head of security who is full of insecurity because he was a laughingstock when he was Iron Man's bodyguard. Like Tony, he turns out to be great at his work if only he can get past his fear of his own inadequacies. I haven't said much about Harley, not Quinn, the overly bright kid who is conveniently the first person Tony runs into in Tennessee, has a lot in common with him, and is willing and able to do everything Tony asks of him. The situation strikes me as too easy, but I like Harley. He has flashes of insight and is unusually smart, but he's not written like an adult, even though Tony treats him like one. I question whether Tony would really go as far as he does in insulting and taunting the kid, and I know a lot of people felt that way. The movie longs to spend more time on this relationship, but it's just juggling too many other moving parts. Black says in the commentary that the film was supposed to make it clear that Tony relates to this kid because he was also bullied in the school, but there wasn't enough time and room to deal with it. So Tony seems to be perceptive to an unbelievable degree when he asks who is bullying Harley at school. Harley helps Tony to fully grow up. Now he has to mentor and guide a kid while he's fighting an identity crisis. I like that Tony has this experience before graduating to mentoring Peter Parker. And the retro-reflective panels on the plane in that movie are a neat bit of continuity. I don't think it's an accident that there's a callback specifically to something this kid came up with, when he's kind of Tony's trial run for what he'll do with Peter. I talked about things that don't add up retroactively once we know the Mandarin is a fake, but there's a lot of really good foreshadowing too, like the hollow fortune cookie speech that I have to give it credit for. I can't believe I didn't call it because it's so well telegraphed. There are plenty of breadcrumbs I realized were dropping early on in repeat viewings. It's not on Fight Club's level, but it's pretty good. Tony, during the Arkham Detective Mode scene, says Mandarin employs a lot of pageantry, a lot of theater. In the same scene, Tony defines what the word Mandarin means, advisor to the king, which should suggest there's somebody above him pulling the strings. And Tony asks Maya if she's the Mandarin when we first see her, a holdover from an earlier draft where she was supposed to be behind everything. But still, a clue that the Mandarin isn't a foreign terrorist, but maybe someone we've already met is him or controlling him. I like that the thematic crux of the movie is given to us in the flashback at the beginning with the card Tony gives Maya that says, "You know who I am." It's not until the end of this film that he fully knows that in an existential sense. I've always been confused on Tony's assertion that nobody says hack anymore. Yes, they do. A, give me a more common contemporary synonym. B, someone on the news in this film uses that word. And C, one of the Blu-ray chapter titles for this movie uses that word. Well, here we are at the end of our session. I don't know how much sense that all made, but I've talked out my feelings, gotten in touch with my inner critic, and I don't think I'm so indifferent to Iron Man 3 anymore. The Mandarin thing might not be what I wanted, but the social commentary is undeniably poignant and well-crafted. The idea of making a movie about a superhero with no secret identity, an identity crisis story, is fresh and fascinating. And while I question the execution, getting Tony all the way from "do I have a heart" to his no longer needing his tech to stay alive, to emphasize the man in Iron Man is the perfect conclusion of the pseudo-trilogy. I guess I like it a lot. I'm giving Iron Man 3 a 3.5 out of 4. And here's a hint for what I'm tackling next time. It's something related to a movie that came out last year. The in-depth analysis format is nigh incompatible with it, and it's related to the only movie I ever gave 0 stars on Superhero Rewind. And if you'd like to get early access to episodes of Superhero Rewind, you can pledge on Patreon at patreon.com/Geekvolution. Become a patron there for just $2 a month, and you can get access to these episodes 24 hours early. You can also get access to a twice-a-month talk show that Eric and I do. It's uncensored and called Geekvolution After Dark. And we do monthly live chats with me. All that and more, and lots of other cool perks there on Patreon at higher tiers. Once again, patreon.com/Geekvolution. And thanks again for listening, everybody. I sure appreciate it. Looking forward to your comments, and I'll see you again next time.